Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's, well, let's be honest, a little bit stressful for a lot of people. We're diving into how to build real financial stability even when you're working with a tight budget.
It's interesting you use the word build there because it really is a process, isn't it? It's not about instant solutions, but
Yeah.
understanding your own financial situation and figuring out a system that works for you long term.
And speaking of systems, we've got a stack of resources here. And one thing that stood out to me was this idea of moving beyond just basic budgeting and into what one source called strategic financial planning,
Hmm.
but like on a smaller, more manageable scale.
Yeah, I like that. Strategic financial planning. It sounds kind of official, doesn't it? But it makes sense because, a lot of people, especially when they're new to this whole budgeting thing,
Yeah.
they get really caught up in tracking every single penny,
Oh.
which is good. Don't get me wrong. Awareness is important.
Mm.
But the thing is, people on lower incomes, they're already acutely aware of where their money's going, right? They need strategies that make that money work harder for them, not just, disappear faster.
So instead of just cutting back, it's about being smart, even a little bit strategic with how you're using your money to actually get ahead.
Exactly. And that's where things like the 50-30-20 rule or maybe finding creative ways to boost your income, those come into play. We could dig into those more a little later.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just saying, spend less. I mean, no one wants to hear that. But what I found interesting were the specific strategies these resources suggested, especially around the needs category of that 50-30-20 split,
Yeah.
because I feel like a lot of people think, well, those are just fixed costs, right?
Totally. And while we can't just make rent disappear magically, one thing that several sources pointed out was the power of negotiating bills. Did you know that sometimes you can get a better deal on things like your internet or even your phone bill just by picking up the phone and asking?
No way. See, I'm guilty of just letting those bills roll in and paying them without really, questioning
It's
it.
an easy thing to overlook.
It is. But I am curious, though, about the wants category because, I mean, it's easy to say cut back on wants. But for someone on a tight budget, those little wants might be some of the few things bringing them joy,
Absolutely.
like an occasional latte or going to a movie with friends.
You're right. And it's not about eliminating joy. It's about finding ways to have it, but within your budget. And I
Yeah.
actually love this one suggestion. One source recommended starting a dinner club with friends where you rotate hosting potlucks. So you're still getting that social connection, but without, you know, the restaurant bill every time.
I love that idea. It's like themed potlucks, recipe competitions. Oh, that would be so much fun. See, this is what I love. It's not about deprivation. It's about getting a little creative and finding those win-win solutions. Like another one I saw was using the library or online resources instead of always buying new books.
There you go. Resourcefulness is key. And speaking of resources, when you were looking through the material, did you come across any particularly interesting tips for actually tracking your spending? Because that's often the first hurdle for people, isn't it? Figuring out a system that works for them.
Oh, tons of good stuff in here about tracking. One source I really liked talked about this thing called the money diary.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I have. And I think what's cool about it is it's not just about like the cold, hard numbers.
Right.
It makes you think about your habits, you know? Like instead of just writing down how much you spent, you write down why. Were you like stressed that day?
Yeah.
Celebrating something? Was it an impulse buy or did you really need whatever it was?
Oh, wow. It's like you're holding up a mirror to your own like spending psychology.
Exactly.
I can see how that would be really eye-opening.
It could be a little uncomfortable too
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
because you're like really confronting those patterns.
Yeah. Right, right. But I guess that's the point, right? Becoming aware of those patterns so you can actually change them.
Exactly. Awareness is key.
Okay, so we've talked about like strategic planning, negotiating those bills, finding fun workarounds for things, tracking our spending. But what happens when you actually start freeing up some money, even if it's just a little bit? What then? Where do you direct it to make the biggest impact?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where we get to talk about the emergency fund.
Okay, yes. Because I'll be honest, I used to think emergency fund, who has time for that when I'm just trying to like make it to the end of the month?
Right. It's so common. People think, oh, emergency funds are for people with extra money.
Mm.
But honestly, it's almost more important when you're on a tight budget because when you're living paycheck to paycheck and something unexpected comes up, it's like,
Game over.
basically, yeah, you end up putting it on a credit card, high interest rates, and then you're stuck.
Oh, absolutely. It just snowballs.
Exactly.
So how do you even start building an emergency fund when like every dollar already has a place.
One word, automation.
Yeah.
Seriously, even if it's just like 5 or 10 bucks a week,
Okay.
set up an automatic transfer, have it go to a completely separate account. That's your emergency fund. Don't touch it.
I love that. And because it's automatic, you don't even really miss it, right?
Exactly. Out of sight, out of mind.
Okay, but what if even $5 a week feels impossible right now? Like truly impossible. What then?
I'm so glad you asked that because
What?
this is where those strategic planning skills we talked about, they come in handy again. And this is where the sources got really interesting, talking about side hustles.
Okay, yes, side hustles. Everyone's talking about those.
Right, but these weren't your typical, like, drive for a ride-sharing app kind of things. These were, and I love this phrase, they call them micro gigs.
Micro gigs. Okay.
So think, like, online surveys, freelance writing or editing,
Yeah.
virtual assistant stuff, even things like testing out websites.
Wow, okay. So it's about finding these little pockets of time or even like skills that you maybe didn't even realize you could get paid for.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
you can often do them on your own schedule, which is key, you know?
Right, right. Because flexibility is huge.
Absolutely.
So it's not this big commitment of like a traditional part-time job.
No, not at all.
Mhm.
And you can even, like, batch them together, you know? Like, okay, Saturday morning, I'm knocking out some surveys, and then Tuesday night, I'm doing a couple hours of freelance work. Whatever works for you. You get to decide.
I love it. It's like building your own safety net, but with micro gigs, it's like bite-sized pieces. Okay, but I have to ask, with all this talk about budgeting and saving and side hustles, I mean, how do you avoid feeling overwhelmed? Because it's a lot, especially when you're already stressed about money, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And that actually brings us to another big theme from this week's sources, financial self-care. Remember we touched on that earlier?
Yeah, we did.
It's so important.
But remind me, what does that look like in action? Because, I think a lot of people hear self-care and they think bubble baths and face masks, which, hey, those are great.
And there's nothing wrong with a little pampering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But not exactly like directly related to your bank account.
Okay, so one source had this really interesting exercise.
Yeah.
And it was all about shifting your mindset around money.
Oh.
Instead of focusing on what you don't have, make a list of what you are grateful for in your life.
Okay.
Like your health, your family and friends, a roof over your head. Even if you're renting, it's still a roof, you know?
That is such a good point because I think sometimes we forget to appreciate what we do have.
Right. And it's hard. It's hard to think about gratitude when you feel like you're constantly playing catch up.
Totally.
But that's like scarcity mindset talking. And gratitude is such a powerful antidote to that.
100%.
And, you know, the other part of financial self-care, it's being kind to yourself. We all make mistakes,
Right. Oh, for sure.
especially with money. We overspend, or we buy something we don't need, or we forget to pay a bill on time. It happens to everyone.
Oh, yeah. I've been there more times than I'd like to admit.
But the thing is, beating yourself up about it doesn't help, right? It just adds to that stress and makes it even harder to get back on track.
Totally. It's like you're just adding insult to injury.
Right. So acknowledge it, forgive yourself, and move on. Learn from it, and use it as fuel to keep building those positive habits.
So it's not about being perfect. It's about being,
Consistent.
yes, consistent. Even if it's those small little actions, they add up, right?
They absolutely do, little by little, you know. And that actually brings us full circle back to that idea of strategic financial planning. It's not about restricting yourself. It's about making conscious choices.
Choices that are aligned with what actually matters to you.
That's it. You got it.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I learned so much, and I hope our listeners did too. So for our listener out there who's feeling inspired, maybe even a little bit fired up to start taking control of their finances, what's one piece of advice you would give them to get started? Like, what's that first step?
You know what? I would say take some time to figure out your why. Why is financial stability so important to you? What are your goals?
Yeah.
Once you have that clear vision, it's like it becomes your North Star, you know? It'll guide your decisions and help you stay motivated, even when things get tough.
I love that. It's about so much more than just numbers in a spreadsheet. It's about designing a life you love.
Yes,
And sometimes those small, everyday financial decisions, those are the building blocks.
absolutely.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us for this deep dive. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
And to our listeners, until next time, keep diving deep.